go over to the CBG side, and then we'll come back to introduce Sara formally. So CARE AI is the Center for Advancing Responsible and Ethical AI. And we've got 3 pillars of focus. So one is AI methodology. So I would say our speaker today has been working strongly on the methodology side, and that's something I'm very excited about in her research. She's found a very important area of application, but she's innovating on developing new architectures, and this is why she's able to publish in really competitive places like Computer Vision and Pattern Recognition, which is the top conference in computer vision. So she's doing innovative work on pushing the technology forward. Our other pillar is on the application side. And so this is a very important application of AI research. And then we also have our third pillar being responsibility. And we certainly think that being aware and contributing to monitoring biodiversity is an important responsibility as good citizens of the world. And so I think this is a perfect alignment in terms of the topic and the speaker today. And so really, these pillars, what CARE AI is all about. We run this monthly seminar series. And for anybody who's new to this group, please get on our mailing list. We have all kinds of great talks, and these are all designed not to be for machine learning PhD students, but the broad group at the university. So they're really accessible talks, and whatever department you're in, we'd love to have you out and be part of it and discuss with us. We're also very interested in increasing our partnership with CBG, and I'm going to turn it over to Paul, who can introduce your institute and tell us about what you're all about and maybe some of the opportunities for collaboration with AI scientists.
Terrific, Graham. Nice to meet you, Sara. You guys have done well on the hair cutting front. I think actually there seems to be quite a lot of hair there. I had a perfect head of hair before the lockdown. Lost the top half on a bad effort. In any case, Center for Biodiversity Genomics, we've been in business since about 15 years, actually. Began within the Biodiversity Institute of Ontario and morphed into a new organization, Center for Biodiversity Genomics, in 2015, reflecting the fact that that's really our main line of business, using genomic tools to probe biodiversity. And I think, Sara, you mentioned in your abstract the motivation for your work, the tremendous reductions in population sizes of many species over the last few decades, on the order of 60–70%. And of course, it leads, ultimately, the threat is extinction, that we're living at a first time in 65 million years, when species on our planet are confronted with the risk of 10% being gone by the end of this century. So, I mean, this is just a phenomenal catastrophe that we must do everything possible to avert. And I think one of the problems in the past has been simply the lack of knowledge to manage biodiversity, and things are changing. The world is gaining the capacity to deploy sensor networks of varying types. We're going to watch biodiversity from the sky with drones and satellites, but a lot of it has to be ground-based. And that's where imaging system, audio recording systems, for the stuff that makes noise and is big enough to readily see and discriminate. And then there's the massive life that you simply can't use those approaches for. And that's where our line of business comes in. We're intensely focused on developing DNA-based sensor systems. We lead an organization called the International Barcode of Life Consortium, and it runs fairly large projects. It ran one project, $120 million project, Barcode 500K, and we're now just launched a couple of years ago our second project, $180 million project called Bioscan. And DNA is not going to be the solution. Cameras aren't going to be the solution. Listening isn't going to be the solution. It's the integration of these technologies. And, as a data collector in the DNA space, we have seen amazing advances in the technology. There are torrents of data being unleashed. The same is true with cameras and listening devices. And I think around the world, we are seeing a general conclusion that, you know, the kind of information we need to manage biodiversity is through the integration of these devices. And so I think the CBG represents one of these empirical groups contributing a data stream. And we know how to gather data. Other people know how to gather images and sound. We need people like you, the artificial intelligence community, to help us deal with those torrents of data. And so I think the seminar series, Graham, perfect way to catalyze these kind of linkages. I'm going to flip it back to you. Before I do, I just want to point out that GeoBond moved its headquarters to Montreal at the start of the year. And NSERC and several federal departments have shown interest in sponsoring a network in biosurveillance and have requested expressions of interest. I will share the contact in case any of you would like to submit an EOI to that for a meeting that's scheduled in late July or August. I think this community would be perfectly, and they're looking for expertise in AI to complement the people that know how to collect data, but not know how to make machines think about those data. So over to you, Graham and Sarah.
Fantastic.
I guess.
Okay, so thanks, Paul, for sharing that opportunity. There's a number of faculty members I see working on the AI and ML space with us today. We've also got some guests. I wanted to call out Deval Pandya from Vector. So for the CBG folks, Deval is the director of AI engineering at Vector Institute. So he's kind of the sort of the Sajivan of Vector, where you guys, you know, you have your own sort of director of informatics at CBG. So I think that call might be of interest to the folks at U of G and Vector. So let me introduce a speaker. I don't want to go too long on intro. So Sara, as you saw in her bio, she's been passionate about the natural world, and her PhD has been about bringing AI and machine learning, specifically computer vision technology, to impact the world. And she's wrapping up a PhD at Caltech, where she's really working with one of the best known labs, Pietro Perona's lab there. And she's done work with Microsoft AI for Earth. She's done work with Google Research, and she's got sort of amazing background. I encourage you to dig into it. I'm not going to talk all about it now, but she's really has a unique background, which is sort of broader to sort of all kinds of different perspectives and experiences. And she's a fantastic person. So please, floor to you, Sara. Thanks a lot for joining us, and we look forward to what you have to share.
Thank you so much, Graham. And thank you, Paul, for basically giving the introduction to my talk. So I think we can go really quickly through the first few slides. That was a really, really awesome motivation for why this stuff is important. Let me share my screen really quickly. Okay, looks good. Yeah, so I'm going to jump right in. I tried to keep it, pretty generally interesting. So I'll get a little bit into some more technical computer vision methodology at some points, then I'll also just kind of give like a much more sort of broad perspective on a lot of the different really fun work that I've gotten to do in my PhD in this space. And yeah, hopefully this will be great. So, like Paul was saying, I think I always like to start with, why did I show up? Why did I spend years of my life in this PhD working on these problems? And it's really motivated by this. Like, we are losing biodiversity, we are losing animal populations at just a completely historically unprecedented rate, at least in the last millennia. And, ecologists, biologists, they've known this for a really long time. And, as sensor technology has become more accessible in the last, 50, 30 years, and even more just in the last decade, data has been collected from just this amazing breadth, this amazing diversity of sensors. And these sensors are, everything like he talked about, these aerial sensors, massive networks of these static remote sensing things like audio sensors, stationary camera traps, And actually another very exciting aspect is just actually using humans as sensors. So taking interested community members and then empowering them to actually collect biodiversity data just on their phone. Now, this is really exciting. But what we run into is all of those different types of data are just being collected at such an unprecedented scale that what one ecologist might be able to sort of manage on their own in a reasonable time frame just is no longer possible. So I have a network of camera traps that I placed in Kenya, and it collected 10 million images last year. So obviously I'm not going to go through and label 10 million images. Those community scientists have collected over 64 million species observations in iNaturalist. And a single aerial survey, doing something like trying to do an animal census, for example, of elephants in the savannah, or looking at migratory bird like population estimation. You can collect 200 terabytes of video just in one survey, in one flyover. And so yeah, just obviously, this is no longer something that we can just rely on a very small set of experts to manage to process efficiently and quickly enough that we can actually sort of make these real-time conservation decisions, right? And potentially implement, hopefully, we need to implement different ways to mitigate these effects of climate change, of human encroachment on biodiversity globally. So this is an obvious application for machine learning, and it's a very exciting one. You talk to machine learning practitioners, and you're moaning about the vast amounts of data you have, and our eyes just perk up because we're like, oh, actually, if you have that much data, we might actually get something to work pretty well, which is very exciting. But there are a few things about biodiversity data that just don't fit in the paradigm of the way that the computer vision research community has approached data sets and benchmarking in the past. So we commonly work with very large curated data sets that are usually taken from potentially images that humans take and put on the web. We scrape these vast data sets like ImageNet from the web. Now these images tend to have a few nice qualities because they're usually images that humans have kind of self-curated. So the thing you care about, like say it's a picture of a tiger, that tiger will be in the middle of the image and big and focused and nice. But so these are examples from a camera trap. And what you can see is that, a camera trap's not as smart as a human. It's not like zooming in and making sure you're really capturing just the thing you care about. And then you're out in the real world. And so you have, bad weather to deal with, or I think more importantly, especially when it comes to like human processing of all of this data, we end up with just hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands of what we would consider empty images. Images where there actually isn't an animal at all, but something has triggered the motion sensor of the camera trap, or maybe you're taking time lapse and so you're just taking an image every 5 seconds. And in those cases, you just have astronomical amounts of empty data. The other important thing is that biodiversity data has a very long tail. And so what this means is that if you look at all of the, for example, observations in iNaturalist, you can see that there are some common species that have basically the vast majority of the observations, the vast majority of the records. So what we can see here, if you make the assumption that you need around 100 images of a species to be able to learn to recognize it well, and that's with the caveat that those 100 images need to be reasonably diverse, then okay, fine. There's like, 10 to the 4th species that have at least 100 images. So we can recognize reasonably well 10 to the 4th species using iNaturalist data. There's another order of magnitude more species in iNaturalist where we actually have observations, but there's just less than 100. I mean, and there's huge amounts of them that just have almost no records at all. And basically, as you collect more data around the world, what happens is the length of that tail doesn't change, because until you hit all of the species on Earth being represented, you're sort of adding new species, as well as most of the time just adding a bunch of data for those very common species. And machine learning is actually pretty bad at this, generally bad at this. Machine learning models tend to be just really data hungry. So if you don't have a lot of examples, you don't have a lot of representation of a species, it's really, really hard to get your model to learn to predict it accurately. And from an ecological perspective, those species that are rare, the ones that we're having trouble capturing frequently, those are the ones that are potentially threatened or endangered, or ones where we really need the information. We need to make sure we're not making mistakes there. So there's this interesting sort of conflict between the way that machine learning is structured and what is important from an ecological research perspective. And then sort of contributing to that even more, you have this biodiversity data is just not identically distributed globally. And that seems super obvious, right, to any ecologist. But there are these underlying assumptions in most machine learning models that your training data, the data that you're going to use to train the model, and then what you're actually going to be testing the model on are coming from the same independently and identically distributed set. And what we see here is that the parts of the world that have the most biodiversity, those tend to be the parts of the world that maybe we don't have as much data. So if you look at species occurrence data in GBIF, you can see there's a massive bias towards data from the Northern Hemisphere. And honestly, there's kind of an interesting like socioeconomic bias. You can almost see like, it's almost a map of the GDP of the world, really, in a way. And then for not only is this like, you have this heat map of biodiversity where you can see that there's sort of this difference in distribution just in where we're collecting the data, but also any individual species is going to have its own specific distribution, a place in the world that you might actually find it. And so this is sort of also contributing to basically causing our models to not generalize very well. So let's look at just a few examples of types of biodiversity data. So something that's very near and dear to my heart is kind of where I got my start in this entire space, was working with static cameras. So I'm on the AI team for Wildlife Insights, and this is like a large NGO that's trying to build a global scale database for all camera traps, where you can both manage your camera trap data, but also get automatic identification of species. Camera traps are really, really widely used. So, you know, we have 12 million records in Wildlife Insights right now, but that's not even scratching the surface in terms of what's actually out there. They're used just very, very widely for specifically monitoring terrestrial mammals all over the world. And because these are these static, not very smart sensors, we end up with a lot of empty data. So it's just really hard to sort through. You think it's hard to identify an animal in an image. How do you really convince yourself you haven't missed something in an empty image? It takes even more time. And then you have these distribution shifts, right? Like every single camera not only has a distinctive background, but the species that show up at that camera are unique. They have this unique distribution over the species set. And this distribution doesn't even perfectly match what you would consider to be the like larger sort of species distribution of an area, because animals are very habitual. So you'll get, you know, a bobcat living near a camera trap, and all of a sudden you see like, oh, 90% of what we're seeing at this camera trap is bobcats. That's not very representative of like how many bobcats there are in the area. It's actually these like micro distributions based on where the sensor is located. And then, you know, the data is really repetitive from a given sensor. So these images were taken a month apart and they look nearly identical. And what this means is that you can almost say that the sample efficiency of the data from a camera trap is very low. If you give a machine learning model both of those images during training, you know, it's not really learning much from the second image. If you have one image in training and one image in test, it's super easy, right? But then you're getting this false sense of security. You think you've learned to do something very well, but really you just memorized what a species looks like at the cameras you've trained on. So static sonar are another example of this. So these are from a project we're doing with Alaska Department of Fish and Game and a few others, where we're trying to look at monitoring salmonid escapement. Trying to basically decide when to open and close the fisheries to make sure you can maintain sustainable fish management. And if you look at the data from sort of these different sensor deployments, these different underwater, like in-river sonar, you can see that not only do you have different bathymetry, different amounts of reflectance from different places, but then you also have some changes in hardware that can cause these sort of to look very different. And then you have differences in the amount of fish that you're seeing. So all of this kind of combines. And what we see is that state-of-the-art computer vision models just don't generalize well for sensors, right? You train something on a set of sensors, and if you test it on held out data from those sensors, which is this blue cis line, then your error is all the way down here. But if you evaluate those models on held out sensors, on things that you didn't see during training, even if it's from the same part of the world, the same species, all of a sudden your error jumps way up. And this actually is not like unique to biodiversity data. All of these things that I've been talking about, I've realized throughout my PhD, they're really ubiquitous across almost all real world applications. So it's not just biodiversity data, it's medical imagery, you know, things like looking at poverty and humanitarian efforts. And so this is a benchmark that I put together with a bunch of people who are way smarter than me, where we actually tried to build this representation of these real world distribution shifts to try to get the machine learning community to work on, you know, not just the fun, simple, easy problems, but actually these, what types of methodologies do we need to create to tackle what you see in the real world, which is that your training data and your test data are just not identical. But so how do we close the gap for static sensors specifically? There's a few really nice, simple things you can do. So one is just, if the sensor is static, sometimes it makes sense to just incorporate really classical like change detection methods from, you know, go back 10, 15 years in computer vision and use just background subtraction and optical flow. And we found that for the sonar, actually, these things work quite well. We were able to really improve our results by just kind of adding additional channels to the input data that were just representations of motion. And then another thing you can do is, you know, if you know the sensor is static, it's pretty simple, but just train a detector instead of a classifier. Reduce the amount of like background, let's see if I can get this video to play, like background information that you're using when you're training your model to recognize certain things. So this is a very, very straightforward, pretty much off-the-shelf detection model, but one that we explicitly trained myself along with Microsoft AI for Earth. It was started at an internship a few years ago. And it's just to localize animals, humans, and vehicles in camera trip data, and not species. And the reason that we didn't go to species is one, by kind of treating all animals as one generic class, you're able to, you can handle species you haven't seen before. It learns to actually recognize animal as like a general concept, which means that if you go put this in, you know, sub-Saharan Africa, or you go put it in, you know, East Asia, and it's never seen data from East Asia before, it actually still works off the shelf for almost all of our users. And what this does is it helps you both figure out what's there. It can help you, you know, find potentially like humans or vehicles that weren't supposed to be there, but it also helps you filter out that 70% of your data that's empty. And that's really impactful for the collaborators we work with. So this is being really, really widely used. Got over 30 organizations worldwide who rely on this as part of their data processing pipeline. And just two sort of nice examples. So one type of use case is the Idaho Department of Fish and Game. So they go out and they put out 2,000 cameras across the state of Idaho, and they do these season-long surveys. And then they go collect all the SD cards at the end of the season. They end up with 11 million images, and then they have to go and try to sort through all of them. And they need to do this quickly because they need to basically make the decisions for how they're going to manage the wolf population for the next year before the next season. And so by using our mega detector, they're able to actually remove 85% of the images and not require human analysis. So then they have their human team then tackle just the images that require human review. And we've actually started to incorporate some classification models for them as well to help filter out wolves from some of the other common species like elk and moose. And then WPS, Wildlife Protection Solutions, they're actually using this in a real-time use case. So they have cameras in 18 nations worldwide, and they actually have managed to connect those cameras to the cloud. And so what they do is they upload their images to the cloud in real time, they ping our API and get results. And then they actually are able to send conservation land management groups, they send them real-time alerts if there are humans or vehicles that are potential poaching risks. So this is something that's able to be used both real time and to process, these large-scale surveys after the fact. So, okay, cool, that's nice. But we still would like to be able to categorize all of those species. And so because we know that we have these really big issues with rare species, recently we dug in a little bit into what can we do? What can we do with what we have, with the data we have, instead of collecting more data to improve rare species performance? And so what we did is we sort of used really nice game engines and kind of synthesized a problem where deer would be a really rare species. And then we found that, yeah, just by generating this very sort of diverse and semi-realistic data set of synthetic images, we're able to really improve performance on that rare species from just the few examples that we had. And then in some recent work with a student at TU Delft, we found that we could actually train some not like pixel to pixel GANs, but actually GANs that are just mimicking some of the like low-level statistics of the realistic imagery to get an even bigger jump in performance and basically make the synthetic data more realistic and basically more efficient. Cool. Okay, so we can tackle getting rid of empties. We can tackle rare species, or we have some tools that we can try to use to do that. But there's still this data that's really low quality. And it's data that human experts are often able to label really confidently. But I don't know about you guys. If you just look at this, right, like you have no idea what's going on in this image. Okay, so maybe there's this kind of blurry thing. Sure. Just from this image, I don't know if that's a tree or a rock or an animal. And the way that humans handle this, and actually, we do this just completely intuitively, is if you're asked to label a bunch of data and you start going through data from a single sensor, you start to just learn, like you learn that sensor. And so, the obvious thing is like, oh, okay, well, in these nice images without bad weather, you can see that the horizon is quite clear. So, okay, that has to be something, right? It's not a rock. But then you also start to learn like what types of species you see when they show up. What sort of size a given type of species might be in an image. All of that is really important contextual information that you just don't get if you're only looking at one image at a time. And humans will look at images, like they'll annotate a month of data at a time. They really start to do this quite widely. And so our human experts said, okay, this is a wildebeest. And I think I agree with them. Like looking through the data, it's like, okay, yeah, no, there's pretty much no other species that has that kind of bulky body shape and it like shows up in these large herds. So probably a wildebeest. But, it's not just that. I mean, it's like we talked about. You can try to learn over time, like what a species might look like to try to help you improve on those challenging cases. And then it also helps you deal with false positives. You can figure out, if it was something that was there all the time and time again, you're like, all right, well, that's probably background, and so you can ignore it. And so what we wanted to do, very much inspired by how humans are actually interacting with the data, we wanted to try to find a way to mimic that within a computer vision model. So our approach was basically to try to build up a representation of data that's seen at a given camera, but not one where you're required to have trained at all on that camera. So something that would work off the shelf, even for a new deployment. And so what we do is you get in data from any deployment and you run through all of the imagery. And what we do is we extract what we call representative features, objects, where they're placed, and we build these representations of, you know, what is seen at a given camera. And we build this up basically into a large matrix that's representing this camera's memory, for example. And then we use a pretty simple approach where we just actually then at inference time, we allow the model to look at a given image. It finds things it thinks are objects, and then it's able to use attention. And so it projects these things into the shared space and finds things that are relevant to make a decision. And the relevance here is potentially visual similarity, spatial similarity, temporal similarity. And then it incorporates that information and then actually makes its classification decision. And you know, this is probably about as technical as we're going to get, but very, very simple. We're doing this just with like dot product like similarity in this space. So you take your object features, you take your memory features, you project them into a shared space, and those projections are learned. And then you just take a dot product and you take a softmax, and that gives you this weight vector that tells you almost like the relevance of each of these sort of memories from all that's seen across the camera. And then you project that back into hopefully your object space and incorporate it before you make a classification decision. And then because we thought that potentially there was even more information that might be stored in the short-term time frame, so because these things take bursts of images, we also incorporated a very, very similar approach across just like very short time horizons. So we're talking now 5-10 images at a time, just before and after the image that we care about. And in those cases, we're actually doing this, this attention sort of weighting and aggregation across all of the potential objects in those frames, as opposed to just looking at the things that we've curated that we consider representative. And you know, this isn't, no good ideas happen in a vacuum. So using attention for some sort of temporal context, actually sort of as we were working on this, there's a lot of concurrent work in the video object detection space, where people are trying to detect certain objects or things in video. But the difference for us is that, you know, our cameras are static, and instead of looking at 30 seconds, we're trying to actually capture months of information. It's a little bit different domain, but I think that there's a pretty strong signal that this is like a really nice approach and a really nice way to incorporate information over time. So we tried this on a couple different camera trap data sets. We also tried it on a traffic camera data set just to see how general the method was. And we saw that it gave us some pretty sizable improvements in mean average precision, which is really exciting. And when you actually dig into the results, you see that, you know, our intuition was correct. What this is doing is it's helping us with the hard stuff. So it's helping improve our accuracy on things moving out of frame, helping remove these sort of salient background things and get rid of false positives, dealing with bad lighting or occlusion. And we were, you know, able to label that super hard wildebeest, which I was really impressed by. So actually, and this is kind of interesting, what you can see here is the box are sort of, that's the representative feature that was stored for each image in that memory bank. And so what I've got here is I'm visualizing the attention weight that was paid to each of those features. And so you can see that it's looking over time and it's finding these examples of wildebeests that are in maybe easier to categorize scenarios. And the other thing is attention is really temporally adaptive. So because you're not like building in these heuristics about what it should be looking at, you let it choose what to pay attention to. You can see that it, you know, in the case of this warthog, where it's showing up consistently throughout a month, it's paying attention consistently throughout a month. But in the case below, where there's just a gazelle hanging out in front of the camera for hours, you get this really nice property where it just pays attention to what's most useful. We also sort of interestingly found that background stuff was learned without supervision. So it's like, it sort of trying to decide what this thing is. It's looking at other bushes in the frame for context. Or here, it's trying to decide, you know, what this rock is, and it's looking at other rocks, which, you know, we haven't really explicitly dug into this, but just qualitatively, it's kind of an interesting property that it's like maybe learning what types of objects are salient but not of interest. And we also do see this nice reduction in false positives. And interestingly enough, we were like, oh, well, it seems at the end, you know, over here, like where we're if you look at the most confident predictions, what we see here is that our model seems to be having sort of more false positives than the single frame model. But when we actually dug into the 100 like images that sort of we were most confident in, and you know, our evaluations that we're saying was false positives, 97 out of 100 of them were actually just mislabeled by the ecologists. So we were, I think our model is sort of catching errors in that way. You know, so this is, I think it's something that kind of points out that humans are not infallible, and really trying to dig into the errors in your training and evaluation data can be really important when you're trying to decide whether something's working or not. But okay, so we're talking about, you know, just single types of data, but getting into what Paul was mentioning before, none of these data collection procedures are going to solve the entire problem. All of these different data types are complementary. They're complementary spatially and temporally and taxonomically. And I think, you know, you can even see that like the distributions and how we're collecting the data, or where we're collecting the data for different data types, or what species we might see, those are also very complementary. And so I think just this really exciting future work for our field and for the intersection of these two fields is just trying to figure out, like, how do we build in sharing information in reasonable and accessible and like usable ways across these different data modalities. So we had a competition last year, and we have an extension of that competition this year that are looking at combining satellite imagery with these in situ camera traps. Cool. So because this was such a diverse group, I kind of wanted to just like do like a greatest hits of other just fun stuff that I've been working on at the end. So I'm just gonna pop through a bunch of like interesting projects, mostly just in the hope that if anyone is interested in one of these things, they could reach out to me. And I think there's a lot of cool work to be done in all these spaces. So one, we have a system that we've built for individual elephant recognition that is incorporated with like Vulcan's Earth Ranger, which is like a protected area management system. And it's in deployment in the Mara in Kenya, and we're going to deploy soon near Kruger National Park in South Africa. And basically, it's like a human in the loop system while we're building up a large enough database to try to improve the actual computer vision aspects. But it's very exciting for our collaborators, the Mara Elephant Project, because they're actually able to monitor way more of their individuals than they could before, where they were only able to monitor maybe 10 at a time, and they had to put on really expensive and invasive collars. We have this camera trap network in Laikipia, Kenya, and one of the big sort of ecological questions we're asking there is, how do you do population estimation for grevy zebras? And, you know, just as kind of like a prototype. But the reason we're doing it there is because they had this amazing community science project where they go out and they have a bunch of humans go take photos of grevy zebras, and they get a really, really accurate estimate of the population. So what we're doing now is we're basically seeing, okay, in the lower quality camera trap data, what kind of population estimation do you get, and trying to compare those two things and figure out, you know, how scalable are population surveys from camera traps versus this like very amazing but expensive and not super scalable community science survey. This year's iWildCam competition is still running for another week. And this one, again, kind of getting a little bit more into the population density space. Instead of just categorizing species, we're asking people to figure out over these short sequences of images, how many animals do you see? Which is hard. It's hard for me. So basically you have to go in and you have this very, very low frame rate video, and you have to try to do tracking or short-term individual re-ID to figure out how many of a given species you see in each sequence. We're also looking at trying to efficiently answer new ecological questions. So it's very sort of, it's becoming more common to ask questions like, what species is in this image? But what we've found is that there's no one size fits all in terms of ecological research. And so depending on the researcher we're talking to, you know, maybe they really care about animal behavior or the health or age, or, you know, they want to know like, okay, we want you to go into all of iNaturalist and we want you to find us every image where a hummingbird is at a flower, right? And so these are kind of these they're almost one-off machine learning questions. Like they're very interesting, but they're not sort of generically applicable. And so what we're trying to figure out is there a way we can learn representations from these massive repositories of data that are as quickly and efficiently adaptable to these new questions as possible? And so we built this whole benchmark where basically you have a ton of data from iNaturalist, and then you're having to adapt to this set of not known, but like fine-grained natural world tasks. And then what I've been working on most actually recently is trying to figure out how to generalize urban forest monitoring. So I'm taking data from satellites, from Google Street View, and from iNaturalist observations, and trying to figure out how you can use these different modalities as like weak cross supervision to try to see if you can adapt better to a new city without any actual human labels. Yeah. It's a lot of different things. I'm really enjoying getting to do all of this cool stuff. There are a ton of these big challenges in biodiversity from the computer vision side, but also just, you know, from, I think that these projects work best when there are really active collaborations between domain experts and computer vision researchers. And so I started a Slack channel a little over a year ago. And if you guys are interested in joining, it's like this AI for Conservation Slack. We've got like 450 people on there now, just researchers from all over the world. And it's a really fun place to ask questions. I think it's a really, it's a very kind community. So, you know, you can ask all the dumb questions you want and people are really happy to help each other out. But yeah, if you're interested in learning more about the space, I totally recommend joining us. Yeah, thanks. That was a lot of information. I hope everyone's not completely overwhelmed.
No, that's great. Lots of diversity, pardon the pun, in different projects. And I think probably something for everybody here in the audience to dig into. So thank you very much, Sarah. I see the virtual claps where we can do the sort of the Google like clapping. Oh, sorry, my phone's ringing just as I'm talking. So maybe I might start out the Q&A. I think it's great that you've wrapped up with a bit of time for everybody to ask Q&A even before the 1 hour mark. So we're awesome. Sorry, let me just get rid of that. Now it's going on to like messaging. Okay, there we go. So maybe I'll kick it off because there's something a little, let's just say philosophical that I'd like to ask. And, you know, as somebody who's probably maybe starting their own lab soon, and you might be thinking about some of these questions. And there's always been this deep tie between computer vision and machine learning, deep learning specifically, right? Like our benchmark data sets are CFAR and MNIST and ImageNet. Like we're very much tied into vision. And that's not everybody. There's many people in the audience, Stefan Kramer I saw there, like who have done a lot of work on sequences and other kinds of data. But many of us in this community are very much tied to pixels. And something I have often thought about with respect to biodiversity, and this might come to any student who's been working on deep learning applications, is you could either sort of go with what you know, right? Like see how you could make impact, continue working on pixels, looking at the big questions with respect to, variability in the images and domain shift and all these things that are very much present in this data. Or you could sort of take some time to dig deeper into other kinds of data. And so Paul is talking about, what's going on with the International Barcode of Life. And so does one say, there's so much life out there that can't be captured by a camera trap. I'm better off making impact by going to the other side and learning more about genomics and, working with barcodes, or could I make more impact by continuing to work with pixels? So there's no correct answer, but I'm just interested in if you've sort of thought about that, because many people might ask themselves that question.
Yeah, it's kind of a breadth versus depth question almost. Part of it, I think, is actually, especially when you're sort of like getting a PhD in something, right? Like you're really, what you're doing is you're building up this pretty amazing depth in a very specific type of methodology, a very specific type of question. I've been doing a lot of reading on the ecology side in the last year. I just submitted a really like way overblown, no one's ever going to read it, like over 20-page review of species distribution modeling aimed at computer vision practitioners, just trying to understand, you know, the actual ecological research, because I think that that's context that I really wasn't getting from my background in electrical engineering and computer science. But I think it's more that we shouldn't be, as the people who care about biodiversity, who are technologists, we shouldn't be trying to learn to be every type of technologist because there's a need for every type of technologist. We should be seeking out those experts and bringing them on board with us, right? So if I, for example, found out that, yeah, we're trying to build some sort of like very representative picture of, for example, the Danger Mound Preserve, which is right here near us in Southern California, owned by the Nature Conservancy. What they want to do is they want to build a digital twin, you know, this representation of that entire ecosystem, landscape, whatever, represented digitally and being constantly monitored. Now, obviously, there's so many different components to this. I don't think that maybe the most efficient way to go about it would be me being like, oh, look, we have eDNA data, so I need to figure out how to handle eDNA. I think what I'd probably do is be like, okay, we have this eDNA data. We have these ecologists who are working with eDNA. And also, I know, you know, a geneticist at Caltech who's been mostly working in another space, but they have these really cool methods that might work well here, and try and see if you can just build those collaborations and those like interdisciplinary conversations to try to leverage people's skills to answer the questions that need to be answered. I think that's the way that I would approach it.
Cool answer. Okay, thank you. Let's open it up to the audience.
I have a question, if it's possible.
Go ahead, John.
Sara, that was a beautiful talk. One thing that kept recurring was the trouble that you have to go to remove extraneous features in order to identify the animals, because we're fascinated by animals. But when you start talking about species distribution modeling, you know, the context is everything. So how much effort is going into trying to look at all the background features, the vegetation, the you know, dryness, the weather features, all that kind of thing that could give you a clue as to why you're seeing the animals where you do at the times that you do?
Yeah, so excellent question. And I love this question. So basically the question is like, how do we take advantage of what one ecologist considers bycatch, but to another ecologist is like the fundamental root of their research question. And so, for example, with camera trap data, we get a ton of this kind of correlative background information that's just like, honestly, really amazing longitudinal studies of flora, right? And so the answer is people are starting to think about it, but there isn't really the right labeled data yet to start tackling it. And actually, that was the motivation behind me getting into this urban forest monitoring stuff, is I was like, look, we have like this, people are starting to work on species distribution modeling from satellite data of trees, right? But in a lot of cases, if we have a camera trap, or if we have a network of camera traps in that forest, you should be able to much more confidently identify the species of trees that you can see from both, you know, this in situ camera trap view as well as the aerial view. Especially looking at how both of those things are changing over time. And then how do we actually think about propagating that increased confidence for a small subset of trees that are sort of visible in these sparsely sampled in situ features, and then propagate that confidence out to the broader forest in some way that's where we can measure our uncertainty. And so I'm very interested, and actually my work with Wildlife Insights, I'm like watching us build up these very interesting and global scale like repository of these camera traps. And I think that there's some really exciting work. Hopefully, if we can figure out in the much more data rich sort of urban environments, how to do this, this cross view communication and then propagate this confidence, then I'm hoping to apply that to the camera traps and at least to trees at first. But I think it's one of the most exciting things about this sort of new emphasis on open data and data sharing in ecology is the opportunity to take advantage of all of that bycatch and also kind of share data collection resources in a much more scalable way.
Oh, it's good to hear. I mean, so are people also thinking about, combining sensors that, the sensors that are good for spotting a giraffe walking across a blue sky would be quite different from the sensors that you need to identify the grasses that are in the foreground. So are people thinking about kind of sensor packages that could, help at all different sides of the biota?
Yeah, so absolutely. And I think that the first sort of forays into that have been very much like image and audio type pairs. So, there are some species that are very visual, some that are very, auditory, and potentially you can cover a lot more of the taxonomic tree by just pairing, vision-based sensors and audio sensors in your same network. I think that you're totally right that there's a huge opportunity for additional sensors as well, and especially things like Shaw Selby's field kit system. So it's basically like a modular, accessible, open source, biodiversity monitoring sensor where you can kind of plug and play and adapt it for like being underwater, adding different types of sensors you might be interested in. I think the prevalence of that type of hardware advancement in the technology will really allow us to start even collecting that joint data that we can then use to try to see what works best, right? It's hard right now because that type of paired data isn't collected at scale and isn't super well understood, I think, in terms of what we could potentially do with it. But I think there's a huge opportunity.
Great, thanks.
So feel free to put your hand up or just jump on. Yes, Stefan, go ahead.
Hi, Sarah.
It's Stefan.
Great talk. I have more of a kind of a computer vision question. Inspired by the mega detector and its ability to generalize to species it hasn't seen before. You also touched on behavior. A research question I've been interested in is, can we learn kind of a general animal behavior on a few species and then extrapolate that to species that we haven't ever seen before? So for example, if you were to train a model on a cheetah running and a dog running, could we generalize that to a giraffe running? Can we quantify behavior on species we haven't seen before?
I think it's a really good question. So Mackenzie and Alex Mathis at EPFL, they're the people who built like Deep Lab Cut. So it's basically like a like just sort of off the shelf or like very sort of quickly and efficiently adaptable to new lab scenarios, kind of pose estimation for like lab animals. And they've been trying to extend that into wild animals. And they have some really interesting work recently looking at like how to build these pose models that will generalize very well. And there's a girl, Jennifer Sun, in our lab as well has a paper this year at CVPR that's this very cool sort of like programmatic style of approach to allow neuroscientists to basically very quickly generate labels or new sort of sets of like behavior representations for their own research questions. So say you have like lab mice and you're very interested in anger, but someone else is very interested in things that they do when they're sick. Basically, it's just a really nice, efficient way to generate the type of training data you might need and hopefully minimize the amount of training data you do need to get something to work well for your question. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I think that pose estimation has been shown to generalize pretty well across species, at least in the kind of representations you're talking about, like things where there's some shared structure, right? They have 4 legs, they're walking on 4 legs, like, or, you go between non-human primates. There's a lot of shared context about how those types of species move. I don't know how well that stuff generalizes to like truly different species. And I think that that's probably kind of an interesting question as well. But I think just the pose estimation at least should generalize. And then I think potentially for now, at least, you might need to do like a little bit of adaptation to get it to understand, running for a cheetah is maybe the same as running for a giraffe, but hopefully it would be almost off the shelf or very minimal, because those things might be very similar.
Cool,
There was
thanks.
a request in chat to share the modular sensor field kit. It might have been Shelby or Selby you had said.
Yeah. So let me, yeah, it's just called Field Kit. And you can Google Field Kit, and the creator is Shaw Selby, who is a pretty amazing conservation technologist. Yeah, so Field Kit is more sort of like a generic sensor suite that's supposed to be very modular, but also AudioMoth is another really nice example of,
You're trying to screen share with us?
Those just to one person, sorry.
Oh yeah, okay. I'd also point people towards Life Plan, which is another project with several sensors where they'll actually ship you a sensor kit if you want to be part of that major data collection project. There's
That's
a
one
wealth
that I
being
don't
collected.
know.
Yeah. It's basically universities. I think it's out of University of Helsinki. Paul even might know more about it than me, but I think that's the lead institute. But they've also got a Duke university collaboration in the States. They're leading the effort, and then there's many partner institutions, including Guelph, who's basically have a setup, and they've got even like fungal spore analysis, malaise trap, audio, camera trap. It's like 6 sensors. It's pretty big deal.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. I'll definitely look into that. That sounds really cool. I think that especially as we get into like the multiple sensor question, we already have issues with like battery life and like needing to go collect the data from the sensors pretty frequently. And I think there's potentially some very interesting optimization research that could happen about sort of like when and how frequently you should be turning on each of those types of sensors, right? Like how do you kind of optimize for your best sort of collection of the broad sort of representative biodiversity information without killing your battery in a day. But I'm sure that, yeah, I don't know. I'm sure that people are already dealing with that quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly sorry, Bob. Active vision is, I think, really intriguing, right? And lots of contribution on the robotic side and RL. And so how can we get more active in our collection efforts? That's a great, exciting area. Paul, over to you.
Yeah, Sarah, I really loved your presentation. Just good facts and great presentation as well. I'm thinking about the scale out of this project. I mean, you know, the goal must be a biosensed planet at some point.
Yeah.
And I mean, astronomy has been, you know, the big consumer and store of data. I mean, particle physics, of course, gathers lots of data, but throws it away immediately. And so, you know, it doesn't have the challenge of storing information. And so, you know, you talked about tremendous volumes of data that are being generated. Is much of this throwaway data, or does it have to be stored? I mean, it seems like the reference data sets need to be there. I mean, how much of it's transient? How much of it needs to be stored? Can you see a scale out plan for the planet? What do you think it might cost? You know, I saw Germany just established a biomonitoring center, and they're talking about €100 million investment just in startup. I guess COVID-19 has given us a new perspective on government spending money, on the volumes of money that we can spend. So, you know, is it feasible to think about in the fairly near term? I mean, people are talking about the loss of biodiversity, 20, 30, 40-year time frame. Can you imagine a biosensed world within that time period? And what will it require?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think, so the data, just starting with the data storage question, I think that's a very good one. Like, for example, with these camera traps, right? If 70% of the images are empty, why don't we just throw them away? Mm-hmm. I think right now, depending on the project, if you're an ecologist, just completely separately from anything, some ecology research groups tend to just throw away any empty images because they don't want to deal with the data storage costs and moving it around. And so they only keep images of animals, and even potentially in some cases, just the animals they're interested in, right? So you're like, look, we collected data for 10 years on bobcats, and we kept all the images of bobcats. I think that right now, especially as we're sort of starting to be able to possibly answer some of those bycatch related questions. So some of these like, oh, wait, oh, you were collecting bobcats, but I'm really interested in coyotes. And I think there were probably coyotes in your survey area. Could I, for example, look at that coyote data? That's something that I think we remove when we start throwing away the things that aren't of interest to us. But I also think that I can verify that the data storage costs are pretty astronomical. I have been a very strong proponent of finding the right industry collaborators to subsidize data storage and even model hosting costs with like sort of in-kind donations. But I also am, just like cognizant of the fact that, when you're reliant on sort of something that's out of your control, there's the potential that it could go away. And so I think about this a lot. I think one thing that we can do definitely is, depending on the data, we might not need to store it at full resolution. I think that, that's something that I've been thinking about. Like maybe the empty images, we just store it, machine learning model input resolution instead of like the full raw image that might be coming off some of these camera traps. As soon as you start getting into video, then the data storage just expands quite a lot. The other aspect is just quality control. So people talk about, oh, why don't we just move machine learning completely to the edge? And then just not keep any of the images that our machine learning model doesn't tell us are important. I think because we're still in this scenario where machine learning is really not as good as it needs to be on rare stuff, I don't want to trust machine learning and potentially be taking some bias that's in a machine learning model and then like building that bias into our ecological models and then potentially making policy decisions based on something where we're just systematically under-predicting something rare, over-predicting something rare. So I think I'm a very strong proponent of keeping the data, at least for now, at least while we're still in this phase where we need to be doing this like sort of human in the loop continual monitoring of the performance of these models. And I think that there's actually a lot more research needed on how to do that efficiently. Like how do we take our human experts and use them as efficiently as possible so we can still get through all the data we need to get through, but we also have this sense of like, that's the quantitative sense of how well we're doing, what we're missing, and what potential biases that or uncertainties that might be in coding that we should be then capturing in the ecological models downstream. As to what it costs, I mean, I personally, just with my own individual projects, run up around $12,000 a month in data storage costs. And that's like one computer vision researcher. I get that. I get sort of grants or funding to cover that. It's sort of part of the research, but I think you can imagine how that scales quite astronomically when you're talking about monitoring all the biodiversity of Germany, for example.
Yeah, I think, the point though, Sarah, you're making a very good point that, this should not be an individual investigator problem. This is something that governments need to take on, just like they established GenBank as a repository for genomic sequence data. This can't be the responsibility of individual investigators to secure their data. We need national policies, international policies.
I think even more importantly than that, if the individual investigators are responsible for storing their data, then you're putting in these implicit barriers to data sharing, right? Because basically, like, if I have a data set and I haven't sort of published it, or I'm not sort of publicly hosting it in some way, then there's just, okay, sure, someone could email me and ask to get access to the data, and I would maybe say yes, and then I can try to transfer it to them, and that data transfer is expensive, and then they have to store it too. I have to give them access to our database. Maybe that's not like allowed by Caltech. So there's sort of all of these just barriers that get put up when we don't have central repositories for this data. And that's one of the main reasons behind projects like Wildlife Insights or iNaturalist, is like the idea that you have a central place where people can be putting their data in, and the benefit for them is that they're getting then this machine learning in the back end, and they're also able to easily share easily sort of access, look at like the global picture of their species of interest, as opposed to just what they're able to collect in their survey sites. But yeah, the data storage costs for wildlife insights are really, really high. And I think that absolutely, you know, it is this question of like, who should shoulder the burden? And I think it should be, yeah, it should be countries potentially, or even, you know, larger scale like consortiums. Another interesting thing is if you look at stuff like GBIF, right? Like the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, GBIF curates information from a naturalist, from Wildlife Insights, from Macaulay and like the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and then from like all of these different smaller ecological projects. But the way they handle it is they have like a standardized data format. They have this taxonomic mapping, because that's another thing that's so complicated when you're working on biodiversity across countries, is that the taxonomies don't agree. But they basically only keep occurrence records, right? And they're not actually storing the imagery in a vast majority of the cases. And so that's, you know, they might have links to the imagery, they might point you to where it is, but they're by just storing the occurrence records, like the actual, you know, they're storing the data product, not the raw data, which I think is maybe another
It's a tiny data problem they have, I think, in comparison to what you're talking about and what the whole biosensor community is going to develop over the next little while. I could easily see it becoming a bigger data storage problem than astronomy, which means we need to think on that same level.
Yeah, well, so I'm working on this community of practice with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on basically just only doing machine learning for migratory bird surveys. And there's just all of these different groups from NOAA and from, you know, these different departments of fish and wildlife across the U.S. that are all using drones or low-flying aircraft. And this is what they traditionally did, but they would just have a backseater look out the window and count how many birds they saw. And of course, that was very error prone. And so now they're starting to do it with capturing video. And this is something where data storage, it's not even just data storage is an issue in general. It's like data storage is an issue for every run. Like they collect 200 terabytes of video in a single flyover. So you have to then have 200 terabytes of hard drives that you somehow figured out how to like set up on your plane to be collecting all of that video and like not losing anything. And so there, you know, there's a lot of interest on their end and sort of like this optimization problem of like, wait, do we really need to keep all of it, right? Yeah, and if you just think about that alone, like say all of those people in this entire community of practice, like 100 different research groups in the US, say all of them do decide like, okay, yeah, we do need to keep all the data. And we also really want to be sharing resources and training these robust models that will work off the shelf for a lot of different species of birds. So we're going to pool all our data somewhere where we can train a model on all of it, because that's what we know will result in sort of the most robust machine learning model. Okay, so now who's going to be storing the like 200 terabytes of data times, you know, X surveys per project times 100 projects? Like, I mean, just for migratory bird surveys alone from aerial data, that's just a huge amount of data. And I think it's a big challenge.
Thank you a lot.
I just actually this morning in our group meeting, YouTube 8 million came up as a data set. I just wanted to talk about that because it was a kind of a shift in thinking. This is a data set where Google, instead of releasing the raw videos from YouTube, they wanted to release 8 million YouTube videos, but they didn't release the videos. They released the embeddings from a deep learning model that had been trained. And so it was some features taken from that model, which are much lower dimensional, and people got used to it, right? And so that's another way of looking at it too. If we could agree on some standard representation of some compressed representation, maybe that's another way that deep learning can assist in this problem. Yeah, absolutely. And that that benchmarking representation learning paper that we have at CVPR that this year is also doing that, right? So we're benchmarking these different ways to generate representations from very large, 20 million images on iNaturalist across, almost 10,000 species now. Which of these representations are actually most diversely useful? And what we find is actually, like, depending on the way that you've generated the representation and depending on the domain that you've sort of learned to build this embedding from. So if you train on
ImageNet, for example, versus building that feature representation and training the feature representation on iNaturalist data, you get really, really different results. And for some questions, the ImageNet representation is better. And for others, like iNaturalist is better. And things like, species disambiguation and challenging sort of fine-grained cases, the iNaturalist data just knocks ImageNet out of the park. But stuff like, oh, are there human hands in this photo? Because in a lot of iNaturalist photos, it'll be like a picture of someone holding the thing that they're trying to observe. So one researcher that we worked with was like, could you find me all these pictures of like humans holding stuff? And we were like, probably. And turns out, ImageNet is much better at that because they have like this concept of probably human hands, right? And so, and then there's another paper that just came out recently in our lab from a colleague named Elijah Cole, and he's looking at these different like sort of contrastive representation learning approaches across domains explicitly. So looking at, building these representations from iNaturalist or from ImageNet or from, satellite data or medical data. And then is there really this thing that's like this universal representation learner, and what is it good at and when does it fail? And I think that they're really interesting questions to be digging into right now for exactly these reasons, because potentially, yeah, we should just be keeping representations. But if we keep a representation that's just systematically bad at an entire section of the questions we want to ask, then and then we haven't kept the original data, then what, right?
Exactly. I think our medical imaging friends are also asking themselves the same question. So maybe, we can collaborate that with them too. Any other questions from the audience?
I can just kind of take a softball. Well, what do you think, from a philosophical standpoint, are some of the greatest opportunities to pursue with AI and ecology?
Yeah, so this is kind of interesting, and it's maybe not the question that like you necessarily want to hear as a computer vision researcher, but I think that some of the most impactful work that needs to be done right now is just data science. Like we know, like, obviously there are going to be these aspects of these biodiversity questions where we have to make methodological improvements to answer them, like things like just, handling rare species well, or building things that are robust to generalization. Like these are, research questions that are methodological on the computer vision side. But there are a ton of really impactful things that we could do on the data processing side for the ecological community that is literally just a matter of building up the community on the ecology side, going around, finding the data holders, figuring out the right sort of perspective on like what data do we need to collect from these different users to build a really representative prototype data set for these generic questions, things like detecting fish in sonar data, or, building like a mega detector that works underwater, right? Where you have these different statistical properties. It's just a matter of like, okay, someone has to do the community building, the interdisciplinary communication, figure out the data pipelining, set up training, and train like a really off-the-shelf computer vision model, right? And that is probably gonna be good enough to really, really, really speed up the work for a bunch of people. And it's kind of like, yeah, how do you build the mega detector style model for all of these different types of ecological questions, where it's like, no, it's not solving the problem, but it's definitely helpful. And if we can figure out the right way to kind of build these communities, communicate like the value of sort of pooling data and pooling resources, have, even just like good data science and like, or computer vision, like master's students or undergrads who like have this clear connection and someone who's able to kind of bridge that gap and bring in that expertise, or even something that I'm very passionate about, teach ecologists to do computer vision, then potentially you can, I think that some of the most impactful things would just be tackling the easy problems right now. And just in terms of like global scale, like really, really moving forward and making progress, I think that there's a huge gap there in terms of just tackling the easy problems, building models that work off the shelf for as many people as possible, and making them accessible. but it's not a very computer vision-y answer, unfortunately. But along those lines, so I really love interdisciplinary education, and I've gotten very excited recently about, I'm in the process of developing a summer school for ecologists next summer. And so Pietro and I at Caltech are going to be hosting 10 to 15 ecology, like late career grad students or postdocs or even early career professors who have a problem they think they could solve with computer vision. And we're going to ask them to bring their own problem, bring their own data, and help them label the data beforehand, and then hopefully train them so that they can learn basically how do you train these existing off-the-shelf models? How do you think about evaluating them? How do you frame ecological questions as machine learning, problems, and hopefully walk out the door with a tool that'll work well, and then be able to kind of then propagate that information to their peers. So
are you thinking about open sourcing the curriculum?
Yes.
For that? Because I could see that something like that running here at our university, and being that many people being interested in taking a program like that.
Yeah, and actually I was talking to Holger Klink at Cornell the other day, and he was like, well, why don't you take this on the road? Because I feel like, and he's totally right. A lot of the places where we're needing to protect biodiversity, where these types of like technological approaches would be the most impactful on the ground, are places that don't necessarily have access. And so building something that's open source and really accessible for different people might be a really awesome way to try to empower like the actual conservation area managers to be able to do more hands-on monitoring, more scalable monitoring.
Okay, well, crowd.
I can do one more if no one else does that.
Feel free.
Stefan, you and I can chat anytime.
This is true. Okay.
No, I was joking.
One thing. Oh, Stefan, I noticed Jorn had come on his camera. I had a feeling, and he had direct messaged me. I think he may have had a question, so I wanted to encourage him to step up. He might be shy to come on, but I did see him enable his camera, and he might want to get in here right now. Hi, Jorn.
Hey, I have a question, Sarah, regarding to your talk, good talk, and I just wonder whether do you came across like metric learning solutions for the long tail problem in your group, and can you comment on that? Because like I saw some paper that say that metric learning is actually pretty good in for long tail classification problems. So I wonder, is it the same trend in the ecological data set? So can you comment on that?
Yeah, I think the advances in metric learning are really exciting. So I haven't delved into metric learning as much specifically for the long-tailed classification problem, but it comes up. I think it's one of the sort of obvious approaches to individual animal re-identification. Stefan's actually done a bunch of work in that space, and all the folks at WildMe as well. But basically, if you are in a scenario, and this is kind of true in the long-tailed classification aspect, but specifically where you're trying to identify individual animals to try to estimate population size for a given species, there are going to be new individuals not seen during training, right? Animal population is an open set. And in these open set problems where you need to be able to accurately determine whether something that you're seeing is matching to an individual you've seen before, or is actually a new individual, and then you should build an identity for that individual, and then in the future allow it to match to that, right? In those types of problems, this idea of representing features and then building the right distance metric, the right way to understand like when things are similar and when they're not, I think makes a ton of sense, and it's by far at this point, I think the most widely used approach for re-identification of individuals in a species population.
I see. So what you're saying is the machine learning approach is sort of like being explored as a baseline, and then the stuff that you're working on is sort of like on top of that, like.
So honestly, it's not even like. So I think it's that I have not explored metric learning as a baseline for species classification. In separate work, doing individual recognition, we've used metric learning as a part of that puzzle pretty widely. And actually, interestingly, like just deep learning, yeah, it just can be sort of, it can be really interesting to try to understand, especially in these very low data regimes, like how to do these things robustly. And so some of the systems that we've built that we sort of found to be the most robust are kind of these weird combinations of like using metric learning and also using some of these like traditional, like very statistical approaches, like for like spotted individuals, just doing like SIFT feature matching or matching curvatures of ears or flukes, like that type of approach ensembled with like a metric learning approach, and then looking at like using metric learning to represent like elephant faces specifically versus like the whole body. Like there's kind of these interesting questions in individual re-ID where it's like metric learning is a really useful component, but it's maybe like not always like the best just on its own. And so some of it ends up being these kind of very modular systems to get them to be robust enough and accurate enough to actually be used in the field.
I would jump in and say, like, one thing I've learned is never underestimate nearest neighbor techniques. I mean, it's effectively the backbone of the International Barcode of Life project and their lookup system, where they may have only a single specimen. Particularly in that sort of low data regime, you're trying to find the best match. Nearest neighbor methods work really well. And then when you combine them with something like metric learning, that's like almost like a superpower. And so you can build very effective systems that way. Something that came onto our radar very recently is there's a NeurIPS workshop on approximate nearest neighbor search with 1 billion examples. And so they're really looking at scaling approximate nearest neighbor. And I think that those efforts that are not motivated towards biodiversity, they could play a huge role on the biodiversity side.
But this is like exactly the question that we're running into with iNaturalist, with these databases, or even with Wildlife Insights, where these databases where you have these millions and getting close to, even larger numbers of representations is, okay, so now like I want all of the examples that show me fence lizards mating. Like, how do you find them, right? And yeah, nearest neighbors is pretty robust. And also, interestingly enough, just speaking on like sort of the generic power of nearest neighbors, all of that sort of attention-based context stuff, you can reframe that in your head to think of it as just like you're finding the nearest neighbors for a given object in your representative feature space, right? Like that's really what it's doing. And your distance metric there, the one that we're using right now, is like cosine similarity, right? It's the simplest distance metric you can think of pretty much. So I think there's a lot of really cool stuff you could do, like trying to build in different types of like learned metrics for doing these comparisons across like a single sensor or across even like geographic context, right? Like say you're trying to build satellite models for land cover mapping, but you want it to work in a new country. Like how do you sort of figure out like with geographically like sharing information across what's seen in different parts of the country and stuff. Yeah.
So I have a follow-up question regarding to the iNaturalist dataset. So is the iNaturalist dataset itself a long-tail dataset, or
yeah.
it is not? Oh, yeah, it is. Okay.
So long-tailed. The iNat dataset that we released this year, sort of along with this sort of representation benchmark paper, is 20 million images, and it's incredibly long-tailed.
So when you say long tail, means that that's usually when I think of long tail, it's like a query in a search engine, like where you have like very long sentences, and then sort of like you fall onto the long tail, right? So what are the, I would say, category that is sort of like beyond the long tail? So it's just like with images with higher frequency in the iNaturalist dataset. So like how do you actually form the long tail?
Yeah, so it's just it really has to do with how frequently people it's a combination of how frequently people see certain types of species and how likely they are to want to photograph them and put them in the iNaturalist database. And so we get these kind of social biases actually on top of like the underlying ecological biases, where like there are a ton of images of bald eagles in iNaturalist. It is far more heavily represented than it really would be in terms of like how many examples you have of eagles in the world, but people get really excited when they see a bald eagle. They want to take a picture of it and they want to upload it to iNaturalist. So we have like these sort of social aspects as well. That long tail is going to be, it's actually really interesting. It's both taxonomic groups that people are less interested in, like slime molds, and also anything underwater that's sort of harder for people to collect data of. And then, yeah, stuff that's just rare. And then another thing is just animals that move really fast, unless you have like a really nice camera and a really nice zoom lens. Like there's some really professional wildlife photographers who are putting in these examples of like these super rare things that move really quickly. But if you just have your phone, like me, for example, I upload lots of images of wildflowers on my hikes to iNaturalist because they don't move, sometimes bugs or mushrooms, but it's like people just have these things that they gravitate to and then they tend to put into the database. So it's a really interesting data set, I think.
Okay, so in the age of Zoom, someone has to be time police, and it's my unfortunate role to be that person today, because I think we could continue talking to you for hours, Sarah. Many people excited about your work, so thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for inviting me. This was really fun.
Thanks, Paul, and everybody at CBG for joining us today, and we look forward to more conversations.